great to have you with us. First of all, I think the sort of big question for us is, why are we speaking about this today? Why is this so significant beyond Jordan's borders?
Yeah, the context is everything here. Look, Jordan has successfully, you might say, branded itself as a force for moderation in a volatile region. A relative pillar of stability. Obviously, it's had a lot of its own problems. It has tons of refugees living on its soil, including more than 600,000 from the Syrian war. You have about 2 million Palestinian refugees, longstanding decades there in Jordan. Their economy's been hit hard this year. The COVID crisis has been escalating in many ways. So it's had its problems. But from the West standpoint, from Europe's standpoint, from that of the US, UK, it is, like I said, a relative force for moderation. And it is a force for moderation in a region where it is wedged between or surrounded by controversial or war-torn or otherwise very high-profile states with strained situations. It's on the borders with both the West Bank, the Israeli-occupied West Bank, and with Saudi Arabia. It's in between both war-torn Syria, on the borders with war-torn Syria and Iraq. And it's being closely watched really by everyone in that region. I talked about the refugee issues. I talked about the fact that, Jordan is seen as having a pivotal role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And let's not forget, it was one of the first Arab states to recognize Israel's statehood, to sign that peace treaty with Israel almost 3 decades ago in 1994. So when you look at the region as a whole, Jordan and its stability are seen as sort of crucial. And anything that sort of tries to upsets that, as perhaps this royal family feud, this rift right now might do, it does tend to set off a few jitters, and more than just a few jitters, beyond its own borders.
And we'll talk about the domestic element in a moment, Doug. You just mentioned that the stakes are extremely high across the region, so it doesn't come as much of a surprise that reactions have been pouring in.
Yeah, pouring in. Let's start with, Israel. It hasn't been officially reported, but there are some reports that there have been conversations on some level between senior Jordanian officials and Israeli internal security officials, in which Jordan has been trying to reassure Israel that don't worry, there was no coup attempt, everything's under control, the situation is fine. Israel's saying, well, we're watching very closely. Obviously, Israel's very nervous. I mentioned all the Palestinian refugees in Jordan. Anything that basically upsets Jordan, and Jordan and Israeli relations have not been great as of late, especially between the prime minister we were talking about earlier in the last report and Jordan's king. They are seen as having soured lately. Israel watching closely, the US and the UK both throwing their support behind the reigning Hashemite king, King Abdullah II. And not surprising, as you might say, because based on everything we just talked about, the fact that Jordan is this very critical pillar of stability, they are not going to abandon King Abdullah II. They're going to give him the benefit of the doubt because they need him and they need Jordan's pivotal role in that region just too much. This is the so-called cynical geopolitics, if you will. Forget who's right, who's wrong, who's saying what, who isn't. The king is going to retain his support. Even Saudi Arabia is supporting King Abdullah at this point. And let's not forget, Saudi Arabia last year detained a whole bunch of its own senior royals on alleged coup plot charges. So this is an issue that strikes a very broad nerve and hits very close to home for Saudi Arabia's leadership.
Absolutely. And Doug, let's zoom back in if we can. You mentioned this earlier, you alluded to this earlier. All of this has emerged from a family feud, a case of he says, she says. Can we call it that?
Oh, it is. That's exactly what it is. Look, there was a former royal chief of the royal court who was basically arrested. You also had a high-ranking member of the royal family who was detained. The former crown prince, and let's underline the word former, Prince Hamzah, he is right now under the equivalent of sort of house arrest. Jordan's officials say he hasn't been arrested. He's sort of under, can't leave his house, can only communicate with his family. He released a video, basically almost a 6-minute video video, he comes across as very lucid and articulate and sober, anyone who's watched it, where he calmly tries to explain, no, contrary to what you've heard from the royal family, I am not part of some conspiracy, some nefarious organization, some foreign-backed group trying to overthrow the royal leadership. There's a family feud in the sense that his title as crown prince was basically taken away from him by King Abdullah II back in 2004. He had been lined up to be the next in line. And a lot of the leadership, this is where the rift sort of started, because Prince Hamzah has been very close, or seen as close, to a lot of the Bedouin tribes, a lot of the tribal leaders and elders in Jordan, close to the people, and he's met with them often. But he says in this video that he told the security chiefs who came to his house that he himself did they think he had criticized the king? No, he had not. So he denies that he's done any wrongdoing. He says that this is the product of a government that's now corrupt and more intolerant of dissent and incompetent. The family feud goes on.
It does go on. Doug Herbert, thank you so much for that very insightful analysis and a story that I imagine will only develop in the coming days.